Right, we'll get started then. Thanks to everyone for dropping your emojis. I see everyone's pretty sleepy today, so I mean, 2 more days to go. You guys got this. But welcome everyone to our second workshop of the weekend, Introduction to Figma. Today's workshop will focus on walking through the basics of using Figma, learning how to build elements of a working prototype, and overall just helping you make your idea come to life. This workshop will have 2 parts. The first part will be based towards the beginners with it being from 11:30 to 12. And the second part will include more intermediate level skills and will be from 12:30 to 1. And then the remainder of the workshop will go towards prototyping and Q&A for any questions that you guys might have. And joining us today is Chris Becker, who is a senior product designer and educator with expertise in product design, design management, research development, and implementation of design systems. But before I pass it off to Chris to start this amazing workshop, I just want to give everyone a quick few reminders. First, we encourage you all to have your cameras on, stay engaged. This is your chance to learn design, so also be curious and ask all the questions that you want. Feel free to network with other delegates as well in our Slack channels to get to know more like-minded designers like yourself. Actively listen and follow along so that you can implement these new skills into your prototypes. And finally, we will be taking screenshots and IG stories throughout the event. And as always, we just want to grab a quick picture before we start. So everyone, please turn on your cameras, smile, and Sheffield from marketing will count us down. So Sheffield, whenever you're ready.
Okay, I'll give like 10 more seconds for people to turn their cameras on. Okay, if everyone can just pose, I'm just gonna spam some pictures. Okay, cute. Thank you, everyone.
That's weird.
Awesome, thanks so much,
Stupid
Sheffield.
Zoom.
Well, without further ado, please welcome Chris, everyone. Give Chris a warm welcome in the chat. And Chris, you can take it away whenever you're ready.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Thank you for joining. As I said, I'm going to be sharing a FigJam file here for us to sort of pile into. So I'll give everyone a little bit of time, but let me share this. Copy link, back to Zoom, and then I'll be sharing my screen. But everyone just sort of come over here. I'll be sharing my screen as well, but you can sort of follow along in your instance as well and sort of come in here. Let me know if you should have edit access, but we'll be sort of following around over here. I'll just be going over some sort of top level like agenda for the day, for the whatever, we're here for 90 minutes. People may be joining us a little later. But essentially, we're gonna spend just a short time sort of chatting about the tools in our industry. I'll give a little short introduction about myself. And then we'll just sort of pile over here to the right to sort of align. I just want to get a sense of like everyone who's here, like what is your experience level with these tools or with some of these concepts, and then we'll jump into a Figma file, which I'll share once we sort of get to that space, and everyone can sort of do that. If you've never used FigJam before, it's sort of useful. You can like move your hand real quick and you can get high fives. Just you move it real fast, back and forth real fast, and you give high fives. Yeah, here we go. Somebody give a high five. There you go. High fives. We can do that. You can also leave comments and questions. These things are locked, so just if anything isn't, just don't move it around to some extent. But I'll sort of be zooming in on these pages to sort of get a sense of this, and then we'll get through the outputs. Hopefully, all of you sort of spend some time in here. Whatever, just be professional. Don't whatever. You can add stuff, but we're here to sort of get our process going. So, as I was saying, my name is Chris Becker. My past role was at a design agency called Better. I now mentor with Design Lab and teach at the Art Center College of Design in Pasadena. I also am an author. I've written a book called Human-Computer Interaction. You can sort of click on these links. And I've also done some other online courses and stuff like that. But I've been teaching in the realm of design thinking and user experience design for the past 15 years. And I've sort of honed some of these skills, written about them. I write as well for UX Collective on UX Design Collective on Medium, and where you can sort of find some of my articles. And I may actually I will post an article that I've written on this stuff here. Where is it? As some of this stuff is actually relevant to some of the discussion we'll be doing right now. Is this? Where's the chat? Ugh, Zoom, you're the worst. It's fine. I'll post it in a second. No, here it is. And what we're gonna do is really quick is I'm going to try and preserve as much time to sort of spend time in the application, but I'm just going to sort of talk a little bit about what I've been doing, where it's sort of relevant in the world of what we're designing and why we use tools like Figma, and then we'll jump into sort of learning the sort of basics. So in my previous role, I was working with a design consultant agency known as Better. We sort of I helped stand up the Ally app. If any of you have ever known of Allergan Aesthetics, they make Botox and other sort of pharmaceutical-based stuff, Juvederm, skincare components, and we stood up their rewards program, building an application that's sort of well-trafficked and liked, and help move other stuff, including the prototyping, UX strategy, and I'll even show you some stuff in the prototyping section of like how we went about sort of doing some of those things at a high level. But at its core, one of the challenges of what we do is that technology, tools like Figma, our phones, all these things, they sort of impact the way that we think. And screens have been a dominant force since whatever 2007, when the first iPhone was released, or whatever. Like even before that, the internet in the early 90s was sort of created, and we spend a lot of time on screens and even the invention of the touchscreen interface has sort of created this sort of ability to interface with a computer in new and better ways to some extent. But it also is a vehicle for thinking. Right, we do our work on it. We send communications on it. We sort of know how to use it, and it's designed by people. And so part of what we sort of need to spend some time is that like you can actually sort of skew the way you think by the tools that you use. So be mindful of that. Like, you know, Figma is a great tool, but it's not the only tool in the list. And if you spend too much time in one tool, another can come along and eat its lunch. And there's a lot of that's happened in my career over time. If you want to design in the long run, like tooling is something you have to pay attention to a lot, right? Especially as I don't know if any of you have been playing with some of the artificial intelligence stuff that's been coming out. It's really important to sort of stay at the tip of the spear. So with that, you know, technology is really built to help us think, and the role of design is that we sort of implement a lot of these ways to do stuff, right? Like we either spend time designing in the paradigms, right? This is from a couple years back on an article that I wrote. We now have a third paradigm, which is now part of the Apple Vision Pro, which is sort of spatial and AR components. Some that's sort of in there. We'll see how much longevity that has, but you know, it's sort of we're starting to live in the future when we're trying to find a new way to sort of interact with computers, but most of those are sort of related to the ways at which we humans respond to things, right? And technology is an ability to sort of help us sort of align to that. Now, tools like Figma are methods for designing software interfaces, stuff that goes in the world and moves and makes things that we do. And we can use a lot of sort of inputs, right? Whether that's the keyboard or your user's finger or their voice or their movements or their gestures or their facial expressions. I think like we were just doing like thumbs up or whatever, and then like Zoom would do like an emoji thing behind it, whatever. Like it starts to recognize this. Part of it's a little bit fun, and then also some of it's a little bit like, what is it paying attention to and not? Like what kind of interface or things that you're sort of learning that it can do. Now, is anyone here familiar with Abraham Maslow? And you can like give a thumbs up in the meeting chat, or like come off and say, yeah, I've read of him. He's also sort of well known for Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Yeah, I guess I had shaking. Okay. Now he was also sort of well known in his particular idea, and this quote is I think relevant. Is that I suppose it's something that if the only tool you have is a hammer to treat everything as if it were a nail. And we use tools. Figma, FigJam, all these things, they are tools. And if you sort of say, I can only use one tool to treat the problem, you will then start to apply that logic that like, I'm going to see everything as an opportunity to use Figma to solve the problem. And that's not really how the world functions. However, Figma and the tools that we use, we want to use them as a way to think. And the goal in learning any piece of software that helps you with creativity or with thinking is to allow the software to get out of your way, that you learn it well enough and you practice it in a way that allows you to not be like, wait, how do I do that with those tools, to I'm now making with a level of efficiency or output, and you can sort of build things that you didn't know before. Now, many of you probably have seen some of the rise of Figma. I've been around long enough to know that like there was a time it didn't exist, and then it started to sort of make some inways, and now more and more outputs. That Adobe was going to buy them, and now they're not because of whatever regulatory components. But they've sort of been able to dominate a level of like how many teams are starting to use them. There was a while that Apple wasn't even using them, and now they sort of figured out the sort of the regulatory and compliance needs that Apple had. And so now you see a lot more people sort of leaning into these tools. They work pretty well. They are sort of designed in specifically for interface designers, like UX and UI designers. They have solved some sticky problems that tools like Photoshop and Illustrator and these other things just like made life very hard. Or even like when I first started my career, I was working in Flash. Have any of you even ever heard of Flash? It's like what it came and went before any of you probably ever started using or in outputs or whatever. You may have seen some of that. Now, the reason these things are important is that there's sort of an underlying relationship that the tools that we apply can change, and knowing that they exist is part of playing with them. But then also there's just some similarities, right? Like if you can use Figma pretty well, you can sort of pick up XD a little bit, and you probably could pick up Sketch. Like I started in OmniGraffle and then went to Sketch and then went to Axure and then went to whatever. Like there's so many of these tools that sort of existed, and it sort of depends on the teams that you're in. I remember my first UX job, I got out of grad school and they asked me if I knew how to use OmniGraffle. I had never heard of that program in my life, but I was just like, yeah, sure, absolutely. Right? And I like went home on the weekend, downloaded the software, got familiar enough with it. It was sort of a mixture of InDesign and some system stuff. And so I became confident enough to sort of enter into the job. I leaned on some other senior level people that I was there to just make sure I didn't look like a complete like dummy with the stuff. And then you practice it and you get better at it. And that's just the core of what we sort of do. So what we're going to do today, and I highly recommend actually sort of checking out these tool databases. They also fill the and also participating in their survey every year. Design Tools is a good one. They sort of reach out to the UX community and say like, hey, well, what's coming up? What are you guys using? What are you sort of engaging in? And what we're seeing a lot more of is this sort of cross tools as well, like Figma into Webflow, or Figma into Framer, or Figma into VS Code or whatever. Like all of this is sort of translating a lot of that as we go, but becoming more familiar with some of these things. And some of them do more specialized things, like Framer is a JS sort of JavaScript based backend no code tool, but sort of aligns quickly into building like applications in iOS and things like that. I think it's actually, a lot of it's built on the Facebook framework. So it is what it is. Again, there's lots and lots of tooling. The more you sort of practice with these things, you can sort of learn the ways at which to move and put things in the world. And that's what we're going to sort of talk about as we go. So what we'll cover is some basics. I'm going to talk a little bit about the basics of Figma. We'll then jump into components and then prototyping. We're going to spend around 20 minutes on each of these things, maybe a little shorter or less. But what I want us to do right now is come over here. I'm not sure where your guys' experience is. So I'm just going to get a little litmus test to some extent. What I want everyone to do is I want you to grab out a Post-it note, a sticky note down here. You can whack S or whatever. You can make the sticky note any size you want, make it the size. But what I want you to do is turn on when you drag out a sticky note, it probably doesn't have your name on it, but make sure to click this show and hide author, and then add your the school you're at. So I'm from Art Center, College of Design, and I live in Los Angeles, and my role is a product designer. If you have a major or like you're in a certain program, please just define that, and then come over here and drop your thing where you exist. So I can tell you that I am an expert in this. It feels weird for me to say that. I'm between pretty good and expert. I'll put myself there. Nobody can be an expert in tools that change all the time. Okay, Waterloo, Ivan, good. If you copy someone else's card, it'll keep their name. So drag a new sticky note out. That was Paris. You can whack S or you can drag a new one. And then you can change the color if you want by just selecting on the and changing it here. And then if you need to make your type a little bigger, you can be like, make my type bigger. You can bold your school. Whatever. Take a screenshot. Okay. Yeah, give some high fives. We got a lot in the beginner, some in the intermediate, nobody out down here in the expert. Okay, so this is about where I expected you guys to be. Thank you, Emily, for sort of telling me this is probably where people were going to land, but I just needed to make sure so that when we sort of moved into stuff, I wasn't like, hey, so here's what a frame is, and everyone's like, what are you talking about? Like, we already know this stuff. This is very sort of simple. Okay, so what I'm going to do next, I'm going to share my Figma file that I'm going to have you guys all jump inside. And you're welcome to jump into this file as well. But if you have your own Figma and you want to sort of design on your own, fine. Like just create a new file, follow along as I'm here. But you can also jump into this file as well. So let me share this. Anyone with the link can edit. Okay, copy. And all right, come join me in here. All right, welcome Vicky, Nancy, Rose. Okay, now Figma is, as you can sort of see by me sharing this with you and all of you being able to join in to this page with me, is that Figma is fundamentally a collaborative design software suite. And when I remember when it first launched and I was reading about their output, I was like, this sounds like a nightmare. I was like, this is going to result in a over the shoulder, like a client who's nitpicky or an over the shoulder art director just like driving everyone crazy because they can sort of like be in the file with you. And designers never really worked in this way, though we sort of did, right? But we had ownership over the sort of core asset. But what I've been proven wrong, obviously, with the success of this thing, but I've actually found it in my career that Figma is actually an incredibly useful tool in the fact that it sort of speeds up the delivery of of content, and most of work is collaborative. Like you need to have multiple people working on the same thing at once, and that actually is a great thing. And what you sort of find is that you don't get a lot of like I'm messing with the stuff you're designing. People sort of like you can sort of build simultaneously, and then even as an art director or someone sort of overseeing it, it's actually really great because you can sort of leave comments and overview it. Now, what we're gonna sort of say is like Figma is sort of based on a logic, and one way at which you can do that is there's pages to the left, and if you open a brand new file, you'll get one page. You also need to sort of make sure when you open just a thing, it sort of aligns to it'll be in your drafts, but you can't share drafts with other things, so you need to add it to a project. Those projects then can sort of be shared and distributed. I always recommend like labeling your files. Never do an output. I have created a little bit of structure here, so you can have a cover, and then this is just an empty page that is just about for creating organization in your out of your pages, but you can sort of align these things, and I'll sort of show you. We'll walk through these 3 steps as we sort of go. But what is sort of helpful is you should always have a cover page. The cover page is also a thing that you can set, and I'm going to do this. You can set this as I just right clicked, control clicked on the outputs, and you can set this as the thumbnail for your file. And so when you go back to the whatever, here's all my files, I can get back to let me go to that page. It's fine. Whatever. When you go back to your like hub of where all your files live, this will be the visual that sort of shows up in your little preview by setting that as the output. If you don't, it'll just use the one frame that you sort of have in the output. If that makes sense. Again, there is every team will sort of organize content a little differently in Figma, but the more you sort of practice on sort of like sharing and distributing that helps. And then I also recommend that there's ways at which like as you share things, you can share people that can just view a file, or you can have them edit it, or you can send them directly to the outputs. And that's a great way to sort of get people to give feedback. I always say, like, if you're building out your portfolio and you do have this work in a Figma file, like include the link, right? Let people view what they're sort of seeing. That hurts you in no way. Actually, it's quite good to show that because you can sort of show that you know how to use these tools. So let's jump into sort of Figma 101. One of the things that I think is and if you guys have any questions along the way, please don't, like, this is a conversation. I'm not just here to sort of like whatever chime up at you. You can put them in the Slack channel. You can sort of align here if anyone's not on the right page. Great. Let me know. We can sort of align to that. But let's have everybody come over into Figma 01 page. And I believe I can highlight myself. I can spotlight me. There's another way that like Figma from a presentation perspective is given some outputs to sort of direct people. Many times in your career, you may sort of be working in tandem, or you're sort of like, hey, come over here and check this out. And we have tools like this to sort of say, hey, like, you know, highlight me or follow me. And you can also use comment tools like, you know, at Emily, like, check this out. Now, one of the things that's sort of relevant about using communication tools like this in Figma is that like the nature of work is that it's trying to be as asynchronous as possible. So I can be working on stuff and I can ping Emily, she can check it out, and then she can tell me like that she's done it, right? By marking it resolved or by adding comments on top of it. And it's spatial, right? Like it's on the file, or it could be on an asset that you sort of design. There is a couple other tools that sort of align inside of the commenting space from a project management perspective and things like that. But just know that like these things can be sort of powerful, but you also don't want to be too noisy with them. But they can be if you have lots of people working on a file. The core of what we sort of work in Figma is the concept of a frame. And the frame is sort of aligned here. So I've dragged a frame onto the page, but you can also do it by whacking F. And you can see over here to the right that this has some ways at which to align preset frames, right? Like if you're working in phones and you need to make something for the iPhone 15 Pro, like I can grab a frame really quickly and it'll line up here, and your frames are the sort of root element that all things are designed in. And the frames sort of function as as both a canvas space to put your elements, but also as a way in which to nest items. And I'll sort of talk to you about how, like a frame, everything should be a frame. So the role of frames is that they are sort of thought about in the realm of web design. How many of you have taken like are familiar with like HTML or CSS, or have ever taken like a web design course? Yeah, I see some head shaking. Okay, Josh is like, yeah, I've taken a web. So the frame is a div. It is a container, right? And there's even some stuff that we'll talk about in a little bit as we get more advanced, is that Figma is sort of leans towards language and outputs that sort of align to building web experience, like coded web experiences, and the tools that we use sort of align to that. So the core of this is that it is a frame, it is a div, it's a container that you can put stuff in, and then it has rules, right? And this frame is an iPhone 14 size. It can be as long as it needs to be if you drag it. And you can also apply things like a grid. As new designers, actually as a designer at any time, never ever have a foundation grid that doesn't have a grid turned on. So you can turn on grids by adding a plus sign. You can modify the grid through columns. And sometimes you'll see people do things like this. You have a margin of 16 pixels and a gutter of 8 pixels. Now, depending on how you're establishing a baseline of rules, but grids are an incredibly important aspect in designing any component or any web page, any interface, because they sort of establish some logic in the way at which it's designed, right? This grid is designed a little bit differently. It's got 12 columns. It uses stretch. It has 100 margin and a 20 gutter. But you could have a baseline grid, right? So if your baseline grid is 4, 8, 16 pixels, then that sort of establishes some things of like, oh, well, what is my, like maybe my gutters are all 16 pixels. And then my side margins would be whatever, 32 pixels. Or maybe it's double that and it's 64. Now you'll get pretty good at doing math in the back of your head or whatever, like as you spend a little time sort of establishing the rules of things. But where this sort of helps you is that you'll spend a lot more time over here in the sort of measurement outputs, and you can be like, oh, I know I'm going to whack another F and I'm just going to drag a box. And this is a rectangle, right? It's just a frame, but it's nested inside my desktop 1 frame. And I can tell you that it's 316 pixels by 146. And if I needed to make it a perfect square, I'd go 316 by 316. And then I can do things to this frame that I need. I can fill it with color. Just going to make it an obnoxious red. I can bevel the edges of it. I'm going to use my grid, my basic grid logic. And then this also has an orientation, right? I know that it's 306, it's at a height and a Y based on, because it's nested inside this desktop 1 image, right? So just like the web, this is sort of aligning to the way at which it's organized. Is this making sense? Now, the reason that we use frames is that, like, can I draw a rectangle? Sure. Can I make the rectangle 316 by 316? Sure. Can I make it red? I sure can. Can I round the edges of this rectangle? I sure can, right? Now, the difference in this object, this shape, this is a vector shape versus a frame, is something sort of important, right? One, this shape is controllable in some of the same ways that this frame was, but a key difference is that I cannot apply auto layout to this frame because it's a shape. It's fundamentally a shape. And I can drag this shape inside the frame if I want to. And see what it did? I'm going to make this a little bit different color. Now, this frame and this rectangle are the same shape and size, but they fundamentally operate differently, right? And the reason that this is actually doing that, and I'm going to show you that this is a frame, it has some rules, it has content inside of it. And I'm telling this frame that it needs to clip anything that's not in that, right? I can also undo that, and now I can see this. But now you can see that this content actually sticks outside of the frame instance. And so many times I see students like, well, why is stuff disappearing? And I'm like, oh, because your clip content thing is on and you're using a frame. Now, a rectangle can be used, but in most scenarios, you want to just use the frame. Because the frame, I can then do things like add type into, and I can whack T, and I can add type, hi, a frame. And I can, one of the other things that's really helpful is we have the toolbar up here. So you're going to spend a lot of time sort of like dealing with frames and outputs. You also have your move. You can also move between move and scale with whacking V and K. And if you're newer to Figma, you'll navigate around the interface with your mouse a lot more, right? But as you sort of move up in your skill level and sort of experience, you'll start to learn these shortcuts. And the shortcuts are really important for sort of speeding up and not making the interface so mousy. And one of the challenges with Figma is that like stuff is sort of cornery in its interface, right? All sort of creative software, whether it's Adobe or others, they've sort of made this idea that all the interfaces live in the sort of margins, like at the top or on the sides. So you have a workspace in the middle, which is sort of logical. And this workspace can even be sort of dragged, I believe. If you need your workspace to go away, you can hit Command \, and that removes all of the interface. So now I'm just like working in the outputs. You can bring it back by saying Command out back. And these things are important for like if you're presenting, like, and you're with a client and you're showing them some stuff here, like they don't want to see all this stuff. It's not relevant to them, right? So you just get rid of it. You're like, hey, check out this box that says, hi, I'm a frame. No, this is good design. No, it's terrible, but I've done it in like 2.5 seconds. But you get my point. Now, the reason that this stuff sort of helps is that you can sort of design at scale, you can move around the interface more meaningfully, and you can design it with logic. Just sort of deleted that, or I can just turn it off. It's like multiple ways to sort of manage content. You can get rid of it completely, you can move it off the interface. And one of the things that can be important in designing and understanding how Figma is sort of controlling things is sometimes you'll get scenarios like this. This rectangle is technically not in any frame, but it feels like it's in my desktop, right? So, but I can look over here in the layers panel, and I'm gonna be like, you know what? It's not located in this frame. So if I exported this would not show up. It would be sort of, it's sort of in limbo a little bit, but I can drag it inside the frame. And if now it clips it. And if I didn't want my total desktop to clip the content, you just unclip the content and it does the same thing. But now I can see that it's nested and it lives inside this frame. Is this making sense? Now, frames as a whole are important because they are your building blocks of sort of aligning and creating things. And they also can be applied in a logic of what is known as auto layout. And I'll show some of this stuff a little bit when we get into talking about components. But as you get more experienced with using Figma, you will want to use tools that speed you up. And auto layout is one of those tools that can really do that for you. And so I'm just going to give you a quick demo on how sort of auto layout functions. So let's say I have 4 cards that I need to have across my page. And they're all different colors. So I'm just going to change the color to green and to blue. And again, this is the going to be a very hideous design execution for the purposes of just showing how this works. Now, you can see that these are labeled frame 1, 2, 3, and 4, and you can see the order that they're in sort of went in the order that I placed them on the page. So where you select them, and to help yourself out, I always do things like this: 01 or 00. This is maybe my home page. Never call things like a desktop. If you need to indicate that it is a desktop, you could do things like that. And then in your frames, this is red, this is orange, this is blue, and this is green. Get in the habit of labeling frames. It just makes your life easier over time. So you can have one of the challenges with Figma is that actually frames are endlessly nestable. But you want to sort of logic out the way at which it's designed. So one thing that I'll sort of advocate for is that Figma is an incredibly powerful tool, but it is fundamentally for executing thinking and design. So if you don't know what you're designing, Figma is not going to help you figure it out. Like a piece of paper and like drawing out exactly what you think it might be is actually faster than what Figma can help you do it. But if you know what it's supposed to be, then you can use Figma to sort of align that and be faster. So use the tools for their efficiency. One of the challenges with tools like Figma in particular is it's not great for sketching. It's like not really fundamentally built for sort of doing a lot of that sort of exploratory stuff. That's much better done on faster methods, whether it's piece of paper or a whiteboard or those kind of things. So stay in those spaces until you sort of know what you're designing and then come into Figma to execute them. That's my sort of, my pitch there. So I have 4 frames, right? And you can see over here in the left that it sort of goes green, blue, orange, and red, which is in the reverse order to how I've sort of logicked them. So right now I can move them around in any order and it doesn't change their orientation, right? Like this frame, it doesn't matter, right? However, the way in which the web is designed is that it sort of does matter. There is a logic associated with their order, and your left side should sort of apply that. So I'm going to select all of these boxes, and I'm going to hit Shift A. And Shift A is a shortcut for creating an auto laid out frame. And so if you look over here to the left, what you'll see is it's created this frame that is auto laid out to the left, horizontal layout to the left, and all the objects are top aligned to the left in that space. And it's created a new frame with the rules of these boxes, right? And this can be my cards. And one of the important things is like, if I needed the green, and what you'll also see is that it sort of built a logic: red, then orange, then blue, then green. If I need the green to be first, I could drag it to the front. Auto layout establishes the rules. And if I had to do this without auto layout on, I'm gonna turn it off. Actually, I'm gonna go back and then I'm gonna turn it off on the second instance. Cards 2. Just gonna drag this above so I get a sense of what that is. If I turn auto layout off and I want to move this card over here, I now have to drag these 3 cards over and then move this one in here. It's a lot of extra steps, right? Because there isn't any rules that are sort of establish it. But if I needed the blue card to be first again in my auto layout, all I have to do is drag it in its order over here. Now, one of the things that's really powerful about auto layout in these tools is that it creates some consistency, right? I know that all my things are 16 pixels apart. I can drag them together and they all move as one. I can also change the orientation if I needed to. And then these also operate in a grid. There's a whole other set of things that go on with auto layout, and it can get sort of complicated pretty quickly. But the core of this is if you get good at these sort of tools, they radically speed up your ability to sort of modify and organize this information. Does that make sense? Any questions here? Okay. So part of getting good at aligning a logic or creating an output, and even in this space, like if I was actually building this for real, I would take all of these cards and I'd also make them auto layout. And you'll notice something that it did. It's like, oh, well, why did it change all the sizes? And it's because these are all hugging the content, and the content that's in them is this high frame, right? But you could also say, I want it to fill the container. That's the type that's filling the container. And now as I stretch, these two were told not to fill the container. These two were told to fill the container. If I tell this one to fill the container and this one to fill the container, now it's going to stretch it evenly across the parent object together, right? Now I'm fundamentally building responsive component, like elements, right? And right now I have a fixed height, but I could also make it hug the content, or I could tell this thing that it needs to be fill the container. And now you can see, look, just that one is filling to the height that it needs, and these ones are not. Getting good at these tools, and one of the things that's challenging is these sort of rules, i.e. auto layout. Auto layout is Figma's jargon for a tool in the web world known as Flexbox. Is any of you familiar with Flexbox or have heard of Flexbox in your web design sort of experiences? No? Okay. This is fundamentally Flexbox. Like what you are designing with is the concept that like an object is going to fill its container and have rules as it shapes and changes based on the container set of rules. And so I can do things to the rules on the outside of the outputs, right? This has 16 pixels apart, all these objects. See, now I can center them. I can move them around the page if I need to based on the rules of this cards frame. And then these also have the same rules. Like, look, I can take this type and I can move it to the bottom, center it. And right now it has 86 pixels of output, but I can make it 5, and it's hugging the content, but I want to fill the container. And now you can see that I can move the content inside this object based on the rules that I've established in the auto layout sort of outputs. Now, auto layout takes a while to get used to, but fundamentally knowing that the minute you sort of apply these things, these objects are now faster convertible into web components. A web developer will want these tools on. And if you use the dev mode tools, like there is a near future where Figma is going to try and eat the lunch of all these no-code tools like Webflow and Framer and all this other stuff, because fundamentally what they're building is essentially web assets, right? And the more you sort of apply these logic tools, it speeds up sort of translating that into an actual web design or an actual responsive web page. So it takes a little bit of time to sort of nuance it, and they can be nested, and there's all these other sort of rules that go into it, but know that like it takes some practicing with this. But what I recommend is even these kind of things. Like, is this a beautiful design? No. Is it giving you practice with understanding how to use a frame with auto layout inside of a set of frame with auto layout? It sure does. And I would sort of recommend practicing these kind of things. Before I sort of keep screaming at you guys about how auto layout works, is there any questions here? Okay, there's no questions. I will move on, and I'm just going to show you something that's sort of useful about responsive cards, is that I can now do this. Like, oh, I had a stack, and now I need them to be all aligned. And they all have different heights, and now I can stretch them because the rules apply. All because the auto layout is aligned to these things. Does that make sense? It's like, look, cards. If these ones needed to be not filled, and these ones need to be static heights, then I can make fixed height and fixed height. And now I can stretch them. Boop, 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 boop. And this frame can be, sorry. I'm trying to get the back frame to stretch it down. Cool. There we go. That's it. Great. You could also apply auto layout at the top level of frames of outputs, and then you can do things like this. This always has to be 100 pixels down. And this, right, this cards is not. See, I can see this cards thing is not in the frame of the i14 Pro. The minute I drag it in there, now it is. It's pushing it down the 100 pixels. For some reason, this one is moving outside of that, but you get my point. Getting good at auto layout as a core component of manipulating objects takes a little time, as you can even see, like it'll do things that you weren't expecting, and you're like, oh wait, what is that? It's because this was in a fixed height, right? And it needs to fill the container or whatever, right? So getting better at sort of learning what these rules are will sort of apply that in more meaningful ways. So we're what 20 minutes in. I just want to do a little pressure test just to make sure that people are sort of grasping what we got here. If I think you guys can use the emojis or the thumbs ups or something like. We can move on to more component thinking, if that makes sense. Oh yeah, so Josh was saying, like, I spend a lot of time aligning, like manually moving things into where they need to be. And auto layout is essentially applying those logic rules at speed and pace, because you're applying it to everything. So you can make sure there's consistency across all of these outputs. Arushi, did you have a question? If I butchered your name, I apologize.
Oh no, you said it right. I do have a question. I was wondering if we did auto layout for, say, like a page on web, on desktop, and that is to be converted to, let's say, a phone page as well, without creating a separate phone frame. If it was automatically getting converted, what would that auto layout feature look like? How would that change? I don't know.
Well, yeah, so it's a great question. So in there, what a web developer needs to understand is the logic, right?
Mhm.
And here I'm articulating the logic of how this thing functions, right? It can get stretched to a certain point, and this is where designers need to sort of show how the functionality works, right? Like, we sort of show you that, like, it looks like this in desktop, and then when you get into mobile, all of those objects stack and they keep their size relationships. Let's say this one has to be fixed height, whatever that same height is, 301 or whatever it is. This is very rudimentary to some extent, but there are more sophisticated tools where you can even make this stuff work even as a grid in auto layout. So it sort of you can establish what is known as a breakpoint. Like at 900 pixels, make this one drop down. And then at 600 pixels or whatever, at 375 pixels, make it a stack.
Okay.
And we want to nuance this. So I wouldn't ever recommend just giving a web developer a desktop page and be like, go make it mobile. Like, they're going to be like, what? Oh, there's a lot of, how does it work? How does it function? Right. But if you build them this way, using auto layout, in converting them or scaling them into multiple screen spaces, you're not redesigning the assets, right? You're just changing the rules.
Mhm.
Does that make sense? So it is, using auto layout effectively can be a 10x sort of multiplier in those like sort of design elements that you can align to. If that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you.
It takes some practice. You guys are all new. Even I've been doing this for a while. Like all we have to sort of do is be like, oh, how do we speed ourselves up in that practice relationship? And then sort of conceptualize like, how is that going to work? How is that layout going to apply itself? And what I always like to say is that the modern web is not a static screen. It is a rubber band, right? Like you have to sort of think lessons as pixels. And this is making you think like, yes, it has a pixel size, but it's actually a container that can stretch. And where does it stretch? Where does it start to look good? Where does it start to look bad? Like there's moments at which you need to know this because your user can do that with their browser as well, right? Like you can't maintain that every user is going to look at your web pages looking at it at 1440 pixels. Does that make sense? And the more we sort of align to this sort of stretchable logic, the better our structure and layouts can be. That makes sense. Okay. So there's lots of sort of, procedural stuff here that can help you speed you up. Obviously, like whacking F and doing that. Never stop using rectangles for background shapes. Only use frames. Frames can be nested. And if you're using auto layout, the rules of the outside frame apply to the rules of the inside frame, and these can be nested endlessly. So just keep practicing those sort of features, and you'll get better. What I'm going to move on to is I'm going to talk to you a little bit about componentry. We'll spend sort of like 20 minutes sort of talking about. Yeah, we have till 10:30, right? Just making sure I'm on track. I'm going to speed up a little bit because we have until about 10 o'clock. So now the next thing we're going to start talking about is components. Now components, what makes Figma really, really sort of powerful, not only just that way I just showed you in sort of rules that sort of apply to the web world, like auto layout, is that it's trying to speed up a centralized control logic over screen spaces. So it's more built on the relationship of building design systems. And those design systems then can be applied to individual screens. And the way at which we apply those sort of logic outputs is through tools known as components. Have any of you built a component before? Or have used components? Okay. So one of the things that I'll sort of talk to you about is that in designing systems, and I didn't actually design this. I grabbed this from somebody else and it was actually sort of bad. So I just sort of helped fix it. But the goal of sort of aligning to creating stuff is you sort of have, it's like a puzzle is like the best way I can describe it. Like any of you like playing with Legos? Yeah, okay. Web design at some level is equatable to Legos. We're just dealing with is blocks anyways, right? A pixel is a block. And we have a kit of parts that we need to establish for the problems we're solving. And then we can apply those kits of parts to whatever thing we want to build, right? And the more sort of baseline componentry that we have, pieces of the puzzle, the faster we can sort of get to solving problems. And it's sort of a cat and mouse, right? Like, would a dropdown work, or does a button make sense to help fix that thing? And we sort of start at the level of a user, but if we can centralize these places where these assets live for us, this allows us to do that. So here, I'll have everyone sort of join me over here. And one of the things that is important to do is you always say the baseline of color and of typography. Type should be, when you're sort of establishing the rules, should be established into styles. So right now, this is an H1. It's 48 pixels. It's Montserrat. It's semi-bold. But it's not a type style. And to speed up your execution of stuff, you would want to convert these things to type styles. So the way you do that is you click this 4-dot thing that says styles, and you say create a new style. And in here, it's then going to have some rules. And I always sort of recommend in creating your type styles is you type out H1, the name is H1, it's Montserrat, it's 48, and it's semi-bold. And what's this for? This is for headlines. And you create this style. Now, what's useful about this is anything that I want to change to that, I can be like, hey, make that the headline, make that the H1, and it can automatically do that. And if I have, whatever, 70 pieces of type that are all H1, if I ever need to modify this and change its baseline output, I can go into the H1 modify, and I can modify the style. So let's say I need that to be 36. Everywhere that that's being used as a style, we'll modify it no matter where it's used on the page, as long as it's established into the styles. Now, this is incredibly powerful tool because it fundamentally speeds up your control over your baseline elements like typography. And then it also is able to sort of maintain consistency for things like your buttons or your outputs or your colors. You can also establish this in colors, and I can show you over here that I've created a color and I've created it as a style, as a variable in the library. And I'm going to do this for the blue one. Actually, I've done it to blue, gray. Did I do it for black? Okay. Let's say I want to modify the black color to be I don't know, let's make it dark green. And it's this O14C, OD, whatever. This is a web logic, but I would then say, I'm going to create this as a new library, and I'm going to add this as a variable, and I'm going to name this the new black, whatever. I would say new dark green. In the name, I put the value O14COD. And the reason this is important is that, like, when you look at in your label, see that I have like salmon and I have the number. It helps you maintain the consistency between these. But I can create a new variable, and now it's in my library of colors. And I can come up here and I can quickly say, I want all of these to be this library new green. Now, again, centralizing the outputs allows you to sort of control your systems at a higher tilt and maintain consistency across your systems and outputs. And also they are centralized. And you're like, you know what? That was not a good idea. I want to change it all back to black, but I can do it faster. And there is some tools here. This is color and color and color. I can select matching layers. This is something they just actually just updated. And it should select all of those together because they're all named the same thing. Type color, type color, type color, select some others. Oh, I maybe have to put these in a that's fine. If you put this all in a frame that were all named the same thing, you can use this select matching layers tool, and it like speeds up selecting objects across multiple screens. It's like really a time saver, because there was that moment I was like, oh, all the buttons need to be selected. Like, shoot, I have to go touch them all, but now I have tools to speed you up in that way. But the core of it is if you establish your sort of baseline of what these things are, it speeds up your logic, and then you can establish those things into buttons. How many of you built a button before? Any of you built a button? Buttons are the baseline features essentially of what we design, and they are componentized. They can be built into ways to sort of structure them and they sort of establish the logic. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to build you out a secondary button just to show you the sort of procedure. And so I'm going to show you the rules of this button. This button is a primary button. I have established it over here as my primary version, and it is a button component. I can show you that. And so if I drag out a child of this object, so here's the parent component, which I've established by clicking that, and now I have a child, and I can see the child because it's an empty diamond. And now in this child, it can be changed. I can make it hover. I can make it a variant 4, which I need to change to say focus. And it can also then be disabled, whatever. These are the 5 states that every button sort of maintains in them. This is how you build sort of functional things, right? Like I have a button and it needs to work. And so I've established the buttons here. And yeah, I'll also show you later, we can also build micro interactions into this. So like when I roll over this button, it changes to hover. And when I click it, it changes to selected. And then there's the macro piece of like selecting the button moves to the other page, but that's a more advanced set of sets. But we're gonna design a secondary button. So I'm gonna drag this over here. The best way to design a button is you whack the type tool. There's a couple ways to do this, but I'm going to show you this way. I'm going to whack the type tool and I'm going to type secondary. Okay, this is going to be the root of my button. And so I'm going to hit Shift A around the button, which turns it into an auto laid out frame. Okay. In this auto laid out frame, I'm going to make the fill container with the type. And now I'm going to set the rules of this secondary button for the frame, for the baseline frame. So the frame 1, and I'm going to call this button secondary. This will be important later. And I then can change the stroke. I'm going to change the, oh, I think that's a 4 pixel over there. So I'm just going to make this have a salmon. Go to my libraries. I'm going to have this be salmon, and the type is going to be this gray. So it's a great button. I'm going to leave it black. Actually, let's make it salmon as well. But I'm going to change the type on the inside to be, I'm going to break it from its type outputs, and I'm going to change this. Maybe it's medium and 16 pixel, whatever. We could nuance this, but now that I've sort of established this, I would maybe go in here like, oh, I need to make a type style out of that. So make a type style. This is my secondary CTA secondary. Montserrat. Monts. What was it? Medium 16. Okay. Now this is just a frame. It hasn't done anything yet. I haven't made it into a component in any way, but it has some rules. I can sort of scale it. It's in an auto laid out frame. It has button potential, as they say. So I'm going to start this, and I'm going to come up here. You can either whack this, create a component, or you can hit Command Option K. But I'm just going to do create component. And it's now converted this thing into button secondary. You can see that it's now a button. And it doesn't have anything else. It doesn't have any of its siblings. So we're gonna come over here and we hit Control, and we're gonna say main component, add a variant. And we're gonna then drag this out, and we're gonna do this 5 times. And I can now just, once I have this box, this variant box, anything I add to the variant box creates new variants. And And so now I can establish the button rules. So this is my secondary button. Maybe when I hover it, the fill goes to that salmon color, and its fill is at 50%. Let's just do something different. Whatever. It's light pink with the thing, and then maybe when you go to the selected, this then gets a fill, and it maybe is a little darker. Have it go really dark. We have the focused version, and then here would be disabled. And so disabled, maybe this, like, rather than salmon at all, it's all this cool gray, and the type is that cool gray as well. And that's my disabled button. Now, in here, like, do you want to say, secondary, correct, but it doesn't matter in the speed that we're working at. I have a button. This is just sort of placeholder. This could have said button. Right? It could be anything it wants to be. But from a rationale of a button that's that is a thing that I'm going to use over time, is I'm going to show you how to do this. A button has a component, and it can set some rules, right? It has a default property as default. Some will say this is even yeah, the default is fine. And then I have the hover property, I have the selected, I have the focused, and I have the disabled. But my button, I can actually establish that the type, if I select all the way into the type, I can set a property to the type. And this is going to be called secondary CTA. And it's going to have, right now the value is button. And I'm going to come through and do all of this is the same. So this is going to have secondary CTA, secondary CTA, secondary. You're just establishing the rules here. And the reason you do this is that when you drag out a button, I can now change the title of this button. I could do it by selecting all the way in here. Let me say this is hi team. That's sort of annoying because you have to select all the way into the type. But I can also do it over here. Because I've established this as a property, I can say, you know, maybe it says click me. And you can see that I can establish the rules of that button here in its child. And if I have other buttons and it needs to say something different, I can say, you know, buy now. You can see that these all maintain the same rules of this button, but have different instances. If you never needed to reset it, you can come over here and you can push these changes to the main component. I wouldn't recommend that very, very often, but sometimes you sort of design in your child and you're like, that needs to go to the main component. You can't actually do that. Or you can also say like, I need it to just go back to its originals. And so if you reset it, it'll reset to the button instance. Is this making sense? This gets done on all assets, whether that's forms, tabs, navigation, checkboxes, radio buttons. All these things can be components because as you assemble things, it allows you to do that faster. Does this make sense? Yeah, and I see that we have 15 minutes left. Thank you. So the more you build these tools out, a library of assets that you can control from a centralized place, the faster you can then assemble these elements into a solution, right? And we start at sort of base level of like a button or an output. I'm going to show you some sort of basics in sort of prototyping. So I have some componentry that I built. If you spend some time in here sort of architecting all of your assets, you can then utilize these assets more meaningfully. I recommend putting them in a page that says all components, they live in the same page. Sometimes you can have your components living to the left or right of your frames, which is fine, but just make sure that they're like not scattered all over the place, because you'll do that. As you get more skilled with Figma, you will use more dense libraries of assets, but you need to know that like how they function. So let's talk a little bit about prototyping. Does anybody, before I sort of move on, does anybody have any questions about componentry, like why they're designed in auto layout and how they have their variants? Any questions here? Now, one of the values of creating componentry is that you have the opportunity to essentially build the way that things function. And now we can apply that function into working things, right? Stuff that needs to be testable. So I'm going to talk to you about why componentry and building the assets of how they work actually can be assembled into stuff that people can use. And that's where prototyping gets involved. Now, the core of prototyping at its top level is that, like, as designers, we aren't just making screens, we are making things that people use. And that means that there is process, right? As UX designers, we think through process, we start to establish the steps and the individual sequences that users need to take to accomplish a task. Now, there are many tasks. It's not infinite, but there's a lot that we can sort of align to. And the core of prototyping sort of functions at two levels. One, as a way to move a user from point A to point B, right? And here's a really simple sketch that we had done with some students about organizing groceries in a list, done in about 3 minutes on a whiteboard. But the core of here is prototyping. These are 5 sketches. You can see that the frames are all numbered. I've sort of dragged in these images. I could have wireframed on top of them, but at the core, I can sort of make this thing clickable. And the way that you do that is, yeah. Oh, there's a question, Mani, about icons can also be components. Yes, all of your icons should be components, because your icons can then be be switched out, and all that stuff is systemized. But prototyping is, if you click on this tab over here, you have some prototyping rules. And so now everything that you're designing is over here. I'm going to establish the prototype as I'm going to change the background to be a little lighter gray. It's an iPhone 14, and it's you can make it the purple model. It's funny that you change these things, but it doesn't really change that much because you can't really see what the model is, but it doesn't matter. Our phones are just black bricks, but we want to be able to visualize what we're designing inside of them. So let's say it's this established as this rule. I am going to start an interaction flow moment, and I can do that and label it. Here is prototype version 1. V1. And essentially what you're doing is you're just connecting screens together. I'm just gonna move these out so there's a little bit more space in between them so you can see this. You have these little handles, spaghetti needles, and you can get really, really nuanced. But essentially what I'm telling this is, like, when I click, I want you to go to sketch 2. And when I click, I want you to go to sketch 3. And when I click, I'm sure all of you have maybe done this. It is probably very rudimentary. But there are some rules here that, like, right now, it's just doing instant. Like, it's very sort of rudimentary. It's like all it's doing is just changing to that slide. But you can also set some rules, like maybe I want it to dissolve, or I want it to smart animate, or I want it to move in. This is good for presentations or outputs, and maybe this is just the way you're doing things, but knowing that that's sort of how the thing functions. I'm just going to set this back to instant for the purposes of this. And then you can establish things like, ooh, let's just go here. Great. Very rudimentary prototype, but I can also test it. I can load it up, and I can clicking through my screens. Look at that. It's really fast. You could put this in front of people's hands and you could get them to touch on the screens to test this thing that you were trying to understand, right? Very, very fast. The goal of prototyping at a core is to sort of logic out this output. Now, in that, obviously, these are just paper sketches. Paper prototypes actually pretty effective for sort of validating a quick idea and can be put into Sketch really, or into Figma really quickly to sort of align this. The other piece that it can do is you can sort of align more sophisticated things. Like I can design out, and because I have the assets designed in their states, I can sort of quickly make this a form that feels like I'm filling it in. And because I've done it here, I can make it the fill in, and then I can make it the one that I've completed. And this says CR Becker 1. And then I can connect these in prototyping. And you can do it on the asset. So I select on this up above, I was showing you from page to page, right? But you can also choose an individual asset. It's like when I click in here, I want you to go to the screen. So on tap, I want you to move to the screen and I would need it to be instant, right? And then when I click here, it needs to be, I'm sort of mimicking, you could build out the number of steps. Like if you needed to show the characters or someone typing in there, you could show it be filled in, but some of it's a little bit pedantic. But my point is that this really quickly is user login. I can sort of show you like, look, completed. And what I'm noticing actually is like, oh, wait, this button should probably be disabled until you complete the instance, right? So even in here, this button, I haven't completed the password, so I can't log in until that's there. But now I can quickly establish this as a rule and align, because it's all designed into the assets of these componentry, I can sort of fundamentally build this thing faster, right? And sequence it in the way that needs to be. And then I could build the other 3 screens that are for completing the password. You could have error states, you could have these other things, all those states would need to be designed, and that's the role of the designer. But if you build them into the assets that you're sort of working with at the component level, fundamentally building prototypes is way faster. And then you can fundamentally put these things in front of users' hands. And one of the best parts about prototyping is that you can, look, here I can load it locally, as you sort of see, but you can also present this. And then it sort of loads it into a sort of presentation space. This is better for doing that. And you can also sort of align things to your, you can also share those with users. I don't know, have any of you downloaded the Figma app on your phone? Yeah. You could also mirror these screens onto your phone, which I highly recommend. It sort of aligns to like sizing and outputs, and you can sort of build, and you're sort of always working on working things. That's the sort of end goal of designing these things. The last sort of little more advanced thing I'll show you is Figma also allows for things known as smart animate. And I'll show you some of these in prototyping. Let me just show you how this sort of works. Let me give a starting. This is transition. Okay, so some of the things that we sort of get into, this is more advanced sort of interaction design, but how things sort of transition. So right now I have 2 cards. I'm going to transform this and I'm going to use the smart animate. And so because this asset is named card basic 2 and this asset is named card basic 2, and you can see one is a component and one is a broken component because it's gotten bigger or whatever. That's just how they managed it. This now has a way to animate these objects. So now you can make your things feel more smooth because they do stuff. And there's a number of these that I've sort of aligned here. And I'll just keep positions so I can show you these things. Now you can see they've done something with the top. As I scroll down, it drags them in. And when I do a baseline, just do this here. Oh, now it's transitioning its opacity, right? So this stuff gets a lot more nuanced. And you can see like it's using opacity in the smart animate. This one's using positioning. This one is using rounded corners. And the value that you can get out of that, maybe I'll show you this, is here is a prototype that we built with a larger team. Is you can do stuff like this. Animate in, animate that in, scroll above, drop this in, see the background changes, things change. I want to be an existing target. I want to do that. I don't think I have my UI button because this stuff is in the way. I can continue photogenic. I can build an animation that sort of makes it feel real, that loads these things. None of this is all done in Figma. And Figma allows us to sort of align this stuff, and then we can sort of build out functionality or features that feel like they work. And if we hand these off to developers, they then develop and align to some of these relationships. Does this make sense? So I know we're almost towards the end, so I wanted to leave like whatever the last like 4 minutes for questions as I sort of plowed through this stuff. But it starts at this fundamental practice. So if you get good at some of these transitioning things, get better at sort of the nuance. If you can't design a flow well, no transition or animation is gonna like save your thing. So sort of get your ideas working well, and then do that level of polish onto the animations or the transitions or where that stuff is most meaningful in your experiences, if that makes sense. Yeah, here I'll stop here and go back to here. If you have questions, let me know. You can put them in the Slack channel. As I was mentioning, I've written a book. It's on Amazon called Learn Human Computer Interaction. I also write on Medium and other places like that. And if you're trying to get better at design, these are some resources I think all designers should have in their libraries and should read. And if you get good at this stuff, then using Figma to execute these sort of concepts is going to be easier. Just take some practice. So. Any questions?
Yeah, I think there's a question in the chat right now if you want to take a look.
Yeah. Oh, here we go. Is there a link to the Figma file for this tutorial? This one? Yeah. What are some tips for deciding which animation type to use when prototyping? So that's a good question for like ease in or instant or like what sort of nuance you're trying to add. What that in the interaction design world, that sort of speaks to like how is it reinforcing your interaction model? So if the user is swiping between things or they're moving in a direction, then like ease in to sort of transition from slide to slide. Let's say it's a form filling out process or you're completing an output, like that can be sort of in alignment with the way at which the user is conceptualizing how they're moving through an experience. And so the animation sort of aligns to that. There's lots of rules in animation, and some of them work pretty well. Actually, one of the challenges is that like you can do some really cool things in animation in Figma, but that doesn't mean your developers have a framework or have a JavaScript sort of animator to actually execute that. So there's a whole sort of argument of like, don't spend too much time on stuff if you know your team can't execute it. But there is ways at which to really reinforce that sort of strategy. And so it's sort of standing back, like what improves the experience? Like, should the card just get bigger, or should it increase? Am I moving it around? Does it feel like it needs to call attention to itself, or does it need to feel like it's loading, or whatever that is? That might help. And then there's some other, like, you can see even in these instances, they're like sort of devoid of content. It's sort of wireframey as samples, but there's ways at which you can sort of align to things like I was showing you in that alley sample of, like, as you get more real content in there, as it sort of gets higher and higher fidelity, what are you trying to get it to visualize itself as, right? Does it load, or is there moving video? Is there aspects like that? And Figma supports a lot more of those types of tools. It's a lot more advanced to like put a video asset in and, you know, align to loading it or doing those things. But we have an opportunity to tell good stories with our interactions, and that's the goal of learning these tools at a high tilt, is that you can sort of execute that. So you're curious about how that gradient worked in the background. I can sort of show you how that's done. So we created a little gradient that has an animation. So it has a little, like, after a delay, move around, and after a delay, move around. And it's sort of put in the background. And what it says is, like, when I click over into that screen, this thing is going to animate after after 300 milliseconds. Ease in after a certain amount of time. And that, because that's in the background of that asset, so that the user comes to that page and it sort of animates there because it's doing that. Similarly, we did that with like my intro screen. So it's like animate in after a certain amount of time. Similarly, we did this with the icons of our assets, and you can see these are sort of designed individually as interactions, and then applied into our pages, into our experiences. This can also be done at the level of buttons. Like, you can design your buttons, and you can tell it to prototype, like, on hover, do this, and so, but it exists only in that image, in that button asset, and then you can, as you apply that button asset, it sort of applies the interactions as it goes. If that makes sense. There's lots of sort of nuance here in using that, and I wasn't responsible for all of those things that we built with a team of like 4 other people. So, but that's what you're trying to get at, is like, where does that polish need to be applied? Like, get the big strokes done, and then you can apply the little ones. So, I know we're sort of at our time a little bit, but I'm willing to hang out for a little bit longer if anybody has questions, or you're sort of curious what we're doing. The short of it is, you got to spend some time in the tools, practice them, get better at them, and do them on things that aren't like your final project. Like that little animate example that I was showing. It's like, it's just a wireframe. It's sort of there to practice the foundational skills, and then when you get to like, oh, I need to do this to a card that I'm designing, you sort of know how to execute it. That makes sense. That will speed you up.
Thanks for answering those questions, Chris, and thanks so much for such an informative workshop. I really appreciate all the shortcuts and actually like going through how to use the different features. I found that very helpful, so I hope that was helpful for everyone else here as well. But yeah, once again, thanks so much for preparing this workshop for us. Before everyone heads off, remember to connect with Chris if you have any more questions, and follow our socials to keep up to date with everything Designathon and UXL related. Our next scheduled event is our UXL mentorship sessions at 1:30 for those who have signed up. But if not, our next workshop on presenting UX designs will be at 2:30. Best of luck on your designs, everyone, and I hope to see you all soon.
Yeah, good luck.